Yeah.
You've been watching the Fauci hearings?
No.
Whoa. Dude, it's wild. It's wild.
What's going on with that?
Still like deeply in denial about everything. They're confronting him about emails they got, about deleting emails in preparation of a Freedom of Information Act request. There's all this like weird deception shit. There's people that said this is clearly leaked from a lab. Look at the Fair and Cleavage sites. They have to be that's put into the virus to make it more infectious to human beings. They're talking about it in the email. And then that same guy, after talking to Fauci, like 3 days later, is like, it's ridiculous to think this came from a lab. This is clearly from a natural and they're all talking about discrediting people who are talking about the lab leak theory. I mean, what they did was insane, and they did it in front of everybody. And finally, Fauci has to talk about it to people.
Joe Rogan, on his recent podcast with Tony Hinchcliffe, talked specifically about Anthony Fauci's testimony before Congress, specifically about, the contradictions that are now coming out. And, the more you look into this, the more wild it becomes, just how quickly regulations came into place that were not based on any evidence. But one thing that I think Joe Rogan and Patrick Bet-David and a few other podcasters are getting wrong when it comes to Fauci is most people thought those restrictions were complete BS. Yes, there were people who 100% believed what Fauci was saying and what the WHO was saying, 100%. But I think for the vast majority of people, they did not fully believe it. I mean, they might have believed some things, but generally speaking, they didn't really believe it. I think instead people just chose not to die on that hill. Right. So if your employer mandates vaccines, are you really going to, risk employment at a time where there's lockdowns and looking for a job is going to be difficult? Are you going to end relationships with family or friends over a deep concerning issue you have with government mask mandates and social distancing? It's much easier, and Jordan Peterson and others have talked about this, to sweep things under the rug. And I think that's the bigger conversation, right? So a lot of people avoid conflict. Think of relationships. People avoid conflict, right? That's not necessarily healthy. There's very few people who engage in conflict, also not engage, but are truly saying what they believe. That's rare. So when you have Anthony Fauci come out with, hey, you need to stay 6 feet apart and you can't visit your family, all these kinds of like travel restrictions, whatever, it's like a lot of people see this as complete BS, right? I remember during the pandemic, like Ted Cruz was down in like Cancun or Mexico or something like that and telling people to stay home. I mean, there were countless stories of politicians traveling at the time when like travel restrictions were in place. And so again, the vast majority of the general public knew this was kind of BS. Here in Canada, there were like house parties and block parties that were happening well outside the city, which, people said, oh, those are super spreader events. And so many people got COVID. And they're the reason why we can't flatten the curve because all these parties are happening and it's their fault. Like, no one wants to remember that. But really, that's, I think, majority of people saw as complete BS. So now that it's coming out again, I don't think it's resonating with as many people because it just validates what we were always thinking, at least. I think to the other point to this, and to take this a step further, the bigger concern we really need to be thinking about and talking about is, I don't know if it's group hysteria. I don't know if that's the right word, but there's a psychological event that happened during COVID. Few actors, the WHO, Anthony Fauci, public health officials, which are very few individuals, were able to convince us of a threat and to enact pretty stringent and harsh public policy as a result. And to me, that's the bigger question we should be asking, because in a society where we have individual rights and freedoms and we have active voices, social media really democratizes voices a little bit more, perhaps than any time before. We were all took, in a way, by public health officials and the requirements that they placed on us, or the mandates that they placed on us. And it happened so swiftly. That to me is the primary concern that most all of us should be actually concerned about, and that's the conversation we should be having. I think it's fascinating from a psychological perspective that even with the rights and freedoms that we have enshrined in our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, Constitution in the United States, and other legal documents, we went along with this. We went along hook, line, and sinker. Again, kicking and screaming, some of us for sure. But we were quick to, demonize anti-vaxxers. We were quick to, I say we, not everyone, but we were quick to demonize people with house parties. People were saying, I don't talk to that person, they're an anti-vaxxer, and we're not on speaking terms. I mean, relationships ended over the types of policies that were coming out. And only now are we starting to unravel the impact of these policies on the general public. Anxiety rates for young people, depression, suicide rates. There are so many impacts from the lockdowns in particular that researchers are unpacking right now. For example, excessive deaths. Deaths across many countries have they have risen across different categories. So, for example, I believe in Norway from 2020 to 2022, deaths of heart disease, cardiovascular, other diseases all rose post-COVID. And that trend is also seen in Western provinces in Canada, in the United States, many parts of the world where death rates have gone up, mortality rates have gone up. We know depression and suicide rates, I believe have gone up, depression and anxiety. We've never seen this sustained level of anxiety and depression specifically amongst young people than ever before. That's really happening. That's happening in our society. Those are just some of the policy of what researchers are piecing together in a post-COVID, post-lockdown world. That's real, and that's what we should really be focusing on, how groupthink has that impact on our society. And it's not about blaming Fauci, because I do think Fauci, of course, the public health officials, it's just madness when you think back at what they did. Complete and utter madness. But remember, they don't gain power unless one gives power to them. And we as a collective, despite our charter rights and freedoms, gave a lot of power to public health officials. We willingly gave our power away. And I'm amazed at how quickly democracy was undermined and undone in a short period of time. And so I think the danger to all of this, I'll make this really quick, but the danger of this is that it sets a precedent for, if people want to say a deep state or, people behind the scenes, it sets a precedence for what governments need to do to go down the pathway of restricting citizens when they choose to. So I know there have been talks by some that maybe there'll be lockdowns in the future because of, smog alerts or climate change events. I think, while that may seem far-fetched and a stretch and a conspiracy theory, I think if I were, a member of the deep state, or if that exists, COVID was a great testing grounds to see what could happen in the future. What type of initiative would be necessary to keep people locked down? You might be asking, well, why would the deep state want to keep people locked down? Why would they care? And again, I don't want to go down this rabbit hole too much, but if you think about it, it's like, if people are locked down and anxiety and depression rates are more sustained over a longer period of time, chances are people aren't going to be as civically engaged as much as they potentially could be. They may not see the purpose of questioning government, putting out podcasts or policy ideas to government, basically dismantling civil society in a way. I know that's a super far stretch, because I don't know if there are any studies on civic society engagement pre and post COVID. I don't know. Maybe someone's done a study on that. But that's one way of, I hate to say this term, and I don't mean it in a derogatory way, but like neutering society a little bit, like keep them anxious, keep them depressed, keep them fighting with each other. Just don't let them do the deep research on what government's doing because, their voices don't matter, if that makes sense, right? So we have your Constitution, we have your rights and freedoms, but during these moments, your voices don't matter as much. Again, these are just thoughts and ideas about why lockdowns did happen, if in fact, and it is coming out like they weren't effective at, stopping the spread at COVID, apparently. I will say that I did find research that showed that lockdowns were effective at children's, so typically, this is pretty wild. Children typically like break bones and have ankle sprains and things like that when they're like horsing around with their friends, right? Well, the lockdowns made everyone stay at home, and so like ER visits apparently dropped for kids. There's some weird stat of like kids are more likely to break bones, like in playing with their friends in their house than they are like at a playground, I guess, or something like that. Anyways, long story short, children's orthopedic or breaking of bones dramatically reduced as a result of the COVID lockdown measures. If that's saving grace, if there's a silver lining there, there's that. But that's what I was thinking about this Fauci testimony. I think everyone's focusing too much a little bit on the actual testimony and what Fauci's saying. It's not surprising to me. A lot of research was coming out during COVID and even before COVID about, that these masks are just not effective. But mask mandates are still a thing. Were still a thing at the time. I still see people with masks today. I'm sure you do as well. So I'm more concerned about the group hysteria, how quickly we all were took, and the precedents that sets for future government action. Remember, we do have individual rights and freedoms inside our Charter of Rights and the Constitution. But in scenarios where an external threat has been identified and the risk is high, you could pretty much kiss your Charter rights and freedoms and your constitutional rights out the window. Remember, in Canada, there was a time where they enacted the Emergencies Act, which prohibited public gathering. I mean, you could be charged criminally if you were in a public gathering as part of the Emergencies Act. Now, that was only in place for 24 to 48 hours, but still, the fact that these tools are available to government, I don't know. It just, to me, it sends a much stronger message about what could happen in the future. Again, these are just my musings. These are just my thoughts. Let me know what you think as well. Do you think that like the Joe Rogans, the Patrick Bet-Davids are missing the mark on analyzing Fauci's testimony and not thinking big picture about this and, what this, experience taught the government? Let me know what you think in the comments section below.